The desert is quiet now, and it's in the quiet that you can hear the land's true stories. Most tales of the West are simple things, painted in black and white. Heroes and villains, savages and saints. But the truth of this land, the real truth, is painted in the colors of the dust that sensate 100 shades of red and brown and gray, all bleeding into one another. This is a story about one of those shades. A man named Luca Redhawk, a man who was born of two worlds and belonged to neither. His story isn't about choosing a side, but about finding a way to stand on the line between them, a line drawn in blood and misunderstanding. The last decades of the 19th century were a time of violent endings and brutal beginnings. The vast and tamed heart of the American West was being carved up, fenced in, and sold off, its wild spirit being broken on the anvil of progress. For a man like Luca Redhawk, this changing world was not a landscape of opportunity. It was a map of his own fractured soul. He was a man born on the line, the living, breathing embodiment of the conflict that was tearing the West apart. His mother, Chada, was a medicine woman of the Ute tribe, a keeper of ancient traditions and a woman whose spirit was as resilient as the juniper trees on the mesas. His father was a white trapper, a ghost of a man who had loved a Ute woman but could not endure the scorn of his own world, disappearing back into the East before his son was born. Luca had been raised in two worlds and belonged fully to neither. His mother had taught him the language of the earth, how to read the clouds, how to track a deer through solid rock, how to listen to the wisdom of the wind. She had gifted him the Ute's spiritual strength, a deep, quiet reverence for the interconnectedness of all living things. But he had also spent time in the white mission schools, where he had learned to read, write, and speak the language of the men who were inexorably consuming the land. He had learned their logic, their laws, their love of straight lines and square-cornered justice. This dual inheritance made him an outcast in both societies. To the suspicious white settlers, the Ute blood in his veins was an indelible mark of the savage. To his own people, his white man's education and his pale gray eyes made him a Wanasi, a lost one, forever touched by the world that was destroying theirs. He had tried to be a bridge. As a young man, he had used his unique position to work as a scout and an interpreter for the U.S. Army, believing with a fierce, naive hope that he could foster understanding, that he could help broker a just peace for his people. He had put his faith in a charismatic, fatherly captain named Nathaniel Kane, a man who spoke eloquently of protected lands, of shared prosperity, of a new future where both cultures could coexist. It was a beautiful lie. Kane had betrayed him and his people in the most brutal way imaginable, orchestrating a massacre on the banks of the Gunnison River to seize their resource-rich land for his own ambitions. Luca's mother had been among the dead. The bridge he had tried to build had been burned, and he had been left standing in the ashes. Now, years later, Luca was a man living in the harsh, solitary space between. He made his living as a bounty hunter, a profession that suited his fractured identity. It allowed him to use both his Ute tracking skills and his white man's understanding of the law, all while keeping the world at arm's length. He was ruthlessly efficient, a phantom of the high desert, known for his cold professionalism and his preference for bringing men back alive. He was a man of justice, but it was a cold, detached, and transactional form of justice. We find him in the dusty, windswept streets of Rio Vista, the very town that had risen from the ashes of his people's home. It is a place of raw, chaotic energy, a boomtown teetering on the edge of the law. He has come here not for a bounty on a man, but for a bounty on a memory. He has learned, through the frontier's grapevine, that the architect of his personal hell, Nathaniel Kane, is no longer a dusty cavalry captain. He is the town's most powerful citizen, a wealthy landowner on the verge of becoming its first official mayor. Luca does not ride into town like an avenging angel. He slips in like a whisper of smoke. He sells a string of furs at the trading post, his face a stoic and irritable mask, his answers to the trader's questions brief and noncommittal. He takes a room in the back of the livery stable, not the hotel, choosing anonymity over comfort. He is a hunter in a new kind of wilderness, and his first task is to learn the terrain. For days, he simply watches. He sees a town divided. On one side are the prosperous, the followers of Kane bankers, the railroad agents. the saloon owners who are getting rich off the valley's newfound progress. On the other are the struggling homesteaders and the displaced youths who live in a shanty town on the edge of town. Their faces etched with a poverty and despair that is a direct result of Cain's land grabs. The line that runs through Luca's own soul is the same line that divides this town. He sees the casual, daily injustices. He sees a Ute elder being shortchanged at the mercantile. He sees a homesteader's family being served with a foreclosure notice from Cain's bank. And he sees the enforcers, Cain's private army of deputies, who patrol the streets not to keep the peace, but to maintain a very specific and very unjust order. During this time, he is confronted by his own reflection. A group of young, angry Ute men, their faces painted with the defiant symbols of a culture on the verge of extinction, corner him in an alley. Their leader, a fiery warrior named Black Eagle, whose father had died at the Gunnison, fits on the ground at Luca's feet. "Wanna see?" Black Eagle snarls. "You wear the white man's clothes. You speak his tongue. You carry his gun. Have you forgotten the blood of your mother?" "I have forgotten nothing," Luca replies, his voice a low, quiet rumble, his gray eyes meeting the warrior's angry gaze without flinching. But anger is a fire that consumes the man who carries it. It does not warm his home. "Words," Black Eagle scoffs. "The white man's weapon. While you speak words, Cain gets richer on our land. He gets stronger." A warrior acts. The confrontation leaves a bitter taste in Luca's mouth. He is a man caught in a vice. The whites see a savage. The Utes see a traitor. Neither sees the man in between, the man who carries the grief of both worlds on his shoulders. His mission, he begins to realize, is far more complicated than simple revenge. Killing Cain would be an act of justice for the Ute, but what of the town? What of the innocent homesteaders who would be caught in the crossfire of a bloody range war? He is a son of two worlds, and he is beginning to understand that true justice is not about destroying one world to avenge the other. It is about finding a way for both to survive. His hunt for Cain is no longer just a personal vendetta. It has become a quest to find a balance, to find a path to a future where the line that divides men is not a battlefield, but a bridge. And he, the man on the line, is the only one who can build it. Rio Vista was Nathaniel Cain's masterpiece, a monument to his own ambition built on a foundation of stolen land and buried bones. To the casual visitor, it was the very picture of Western prosperity, a bustling hub of commerce and opportunity. But to Luca, who walked its streets with the discerning eye of a hunter, the town was a gilded cage, and its citizens were all prisoners, whether they knew it or not. Cain's power was not overt, it was insidious, woven into the very fabric of the town's existence. He owned the bank that held the mortgages on nearly every farm and business. He owned the mercantile that set the prices for supplies. He controlled the water rights, the lifeblood of the entire valley. And he controlled the law, embodied by his hand-picked sheriff, a man named Marcus Thorne, whose primary qualification for the job was his unquestioning loyalty to his benefactor. Cain didn't need to rule with an iron fist, he ruled with a ledger book and a smile, a far more effective and insidious form of tyranny. Luca's first task was to understand the mechanics of this tyranny. He spent his days in quiet observation and his nights in silent exploration. He was a ghost in the machine, studying its gears. He saw how Cain masterfully played the two halves of the community against each other. To the white homesteaders, he was the champion of progress, the man who had driven out the hostile Utes and made the valley safe for settlement. He stoked their fears and their prejudices, ensuring they saw the remaining Utes not as neighbors, but as a threat, a constant reminder of a savage past. To the Utes, he presented a different face. He made a great show of providing them with government rations often of the poorest quality and offered them low-paying, back-breaking labor in his mines. It was a calculated form of subjugation disguised as charity, designed to keep them dependent and powerless, a permanent underclass in the land that had once been their own. Luca's dual heritage gave him a unique and painful perspective. He could move, albeit with difficulty, between both worlds. He spent time in the saloons, listening to the boasts and grievances of the white settlers. He heard their genuine hopes for a better life, but he also heard the casual, ingrained racism, the easy acceptance of Cain's narrative that the Utes were an obstacle to be managed, not a people to be respected. He also spent time in the shanty town on the edge of town, the place the whites called Ute Town. Here, he saw the other side of Cain's progress. He saw the poverty, the disease, the quiet, soul-crushing despair of a people whose culture and way of life had been systematically dismantled. He spoke with the elders, his youth fluent and respectful. He saw the deep distrust in their eyes when they looked at him, the men who had worn the blue coat. But he also saw a flicker of desperate hope. He was one of them, yet he understood the white man's world. Perhaps he could be the voice they had lost. It was here that he once again encountered Black Eagle. The young warrior, whose anger was raw, open-wound, was trying to organize the younger youths into a war party. He spoke of raids, of reclaiming their land with blood and fire. "You see this, wanna see," Black Eagle said, gesturing to the squalor of the shantytown. "This is the peace your friend Cain has given us. Is this what your mother died for?" "My mother died for a future that men like you and men like Cain will never allow to happen," Luca replied, his voice low and firm. "You both believe that the only answer is the destruction of the other. You are two sides of the same coin of hate. And what is your answer, then, wise one?" Black Eagle sneered. "Justice," Luca said simply. "Not vengeance. Justice is a foundation you can build on. Vengeance is a fire that leaves only ashes." Luca knew that a violent uprising by the Utes was exactly what Cain wanted. It would give him the perfect excuse to call in the army and complete the house cleaning he had started at the Gunnison. It would validate all his claims of Ute savagery and cement his position as the town's protector. Black Eagle's righteous anger was a tool that Cain would use to destroy the very people he claimed to be fighting for. Luca's path became clearer and infinitely more difficult. He couldn't just expose Cain's past crimes, he had to prevent a new war from erupting in the present. He had to protect the people of Rio Vista, both the white homesteaders and the Utes, from Cain, and from themselves. He began to gather his own intelligence. He used his tracking skills to follow Cain's enforcers, learning their routines, their weaknesses. He discovered that Cain was running a smuggling operation, using his control of the town to move illegal whiskey and firearms across the border. A profitable side enterprise that his powerful investors in Denver knew nothing about. This was Cain's secret vulnerability, a crack in his armor of respectability. His investigation led him to a surprising and potentially valuable source, Sarah, the young woman who ran the town's small newspaper. Sarah was a newcomer from the East, a woman of fierce intelligence and a deeply ingrained belief in the power of the truth. She had initially been a supporter of Cain, taken in by his vision of progress. But she was too smart not to see the fear and injustice that lay just beneath the town's prosperous surface. She had started to ask questions, to write editorials that hinted at the darker side of Cain's rule, and had found herself the target of subtle but unmistakable intimidation from his men. Luca approached her one night, a shadow appearing at the back door of her small print shop. He didn't come with threats or demands. He came with a story. He told her about a shipment of mining supplies that Cain was expecting, and he told her where his men were planning to hide it. It was a piece of information he had learned from his silent surveillance, a test of her courage. "I believe in the truth, mister," she said, her eyes searching his face. "Red Hawk," he supplied. "I believe in the truth, mister." "Red Hawk," she repeated. "But in a town like this, the truth can be a very dangerous thing to print." "The truth is only dangerous to those who have something to hide," Luca replied. "A cage is only strong as long as the prisoners don't realize the door isn't locked." He left her with the information, a single seed of truth planted in the only fertile ground he had found in Rio Vista. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a strategist, fighting a war on multiple fronts. He was trying to disarm the righteous anger of his own people, while simultaneously arming the town's conscience with the one weapon Nathaniel Cain could not defeat, the truth. Sarah Connolly was a woman caught between her principles and the harsh reality of the frontier. She had come to Rio Vista with her father, a hopeful printer who had believed in the promise of the West, only to see him succumb to a fever a year after their arrival. Left with only the small, struggling newspaper, the Rio Vista Clarion, she had dedicated herself to his dream of building a community founded on information and open discourse. It was a noble, and increasingly dangerous, ambition in a town owned by Nathaniel Cain. Her initial admiration for Cain's vision had slowly eroded, replaced by a growing unease. She had seen the fear in the eyes of the homesteaders who came to her office to place foreclosure notices. She had seen the casual brutality of Cain's deputies. And she had felt the subtle but chilling pressure to only print good news, to be a mouthpiece for the town's progress rather than a mirror to its soul. Luca Redhawk's nocturnal visit had been a match struck in the darkness of her own doubts. She decided to investigate his claim. Armed with a healthy dose of skepticism and a small, easily concealed notepad, she followed his directions to a series of old, abandoned mine shafts in the hills outside of town. What she found confirmed her worst fears and validated Luca's story. She watched from a hidden vantage point as a heavily guarded wagon, marked with the insignia of Kane's mining company, did not deliver its contents crates, marked tools, and drill bits to the main mine. Instead, under the cover of darkness, Kane's men unloaded the crates into one of the abandoned shafts. The mining supplies were, in fact, dozens of new Winchester rifles and cases of whiskey. It was a smuggling operation, clear and simple. Printing the story would be an act of journalistic suicide. Kane would crush her, ruin her, and drive her out of town, if not worse. For a day and a night, she wrestled with her conscience. Her father's dream had been to build, not to destroy. But what if the only way to build something true was to first tear down the lie? She chose the truth. Her next edition of the Clarion featured a front-page story, carefully worded but devastating in its implications. Under the headline "Questions Raised Over Mining Shipments," she detailed her anonymous tip and her own eyewitness account of the suspicious delivery. She didn't explicitly accuse Kane of smuggling. She simply laid out the facts and asked the questions. Why were valuable supplies being stored in a derelict mine? Why was the delivery made at night? Why was the shipment so heavily guarded? It was a masterpiece of innuendo, an article that convicted Kane without ever naming him as the criminal. The effect on the town was electric. The newspaper, which had been a placid and predictable digest of local news, had suddenly become a weapon. The story gave voice to the whispers and suspicions that had been festering for months. It created a crack in the dam of silence, and through that crack, the truth began to seep. People bought the paper in record numbers, reading it in hushed groups, their faces a mixture of fear and a new, dangerous excitement. Kane's reaction was swift and furious. He stormed into the newspaper office, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He found Sarah calmly setting type for the next edition. "What is the meaning of this slander?" he roared, slamming the newspaper down on her desk. "You are printing lies. You are trying to undermine the prosperity of this entire community." "I am printing facts, Mr. Kane," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "And I am asking questions. It is the job of a newspaper to ask questions on behalf of the people. Are you saying the people of Rio Vista do not have a right to know how your company conducts its business?" She had him trapped. His power was based on his image as a legitimate, benevolent leader. He could not be seen to be silencing a free press, especially not a woman. He was a politician now, and he had to play by a different set of rules. He resorted to threats, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You are playing a very dangerous game, Miss Connolly," he warned. "This is a rough country. Accidents happen. Fires start. A young woman on her own. She should be more careful." He stormed out, leaving the threat hanging in the air. That night, 2 of his thugs paid a visit to the Clarion office. They didn't harm Sarah. They did something more insidious. They smashed her printing press, the intricate, beautiful machine that was her father's legacy and her only means of livelihood. They poured her ink into the street and scattered her painstakingly set type across the floor. They left her not with bruises, but with a message of utter, absolute ruin. They thought they had silenced her. But as Sarah stood in the wreckage of her dreams, her despair slowly gave way to a cold, hard anger. Kane had made a fatal mistake. He had not just destroyed her press, he had destroyed the last of her reservations. He had turned a journalist into a revolutionary. She found Luca at a prearranged meeting spot in the hills. She told him what had happened, her voice trembling not with fear, but with rage. "He didn't silence me," she said, her eyes blazing. "He just gave me a better story to tell. But I can't tell it without a voice." "Then we will find you one," Luca said. He saw in her not a damsel in distress, but a warrior, a different kind of warrior than he was used to, but one no less fierce. He had been a man caught between 2 worlds, fighting a lonely war. Now, the ghost and the journalist had formed an alliance. She would be his voice, he would be her sword. And together, they would begin to dismantle Kane's empire, one fact, and one arrow at a time. The destruction of the printing press was a declaration of war. Cain had made it clear that he would not tolerate dissent, and that the truth had no place in his version of Rio Vista. The alliance between Luca and Sarah was now forged in the fire of this shared conviction. Their fight was no longer just about exposing Cain's smuggling, it was about exposing the original sin upon which his entire empire was built: massacre at the Gunnison River. But to do that, they needed more than just Luca's testimony. They needed proof. Their quest for that proof led them to the last, forgotten relics of the massacre, the official U.S. Army records of the battle. They knew that Cain, as the commanding officer, would have filed a report, an official, self-serving account that would have been sent to the territorial fort. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had. The journey to Fort Garland was a perilous one, a 100-mile ride through hostile territory, made all the more dangerous by the fact that Cain, suspecting their intentions, would have his men watching the trails. They traveled separately. Sarah, posing as a schoolteacher on her way to visit a sick relative in Denver, took the public stagecoach. Luca, a ghost in the wilderness, followed from a distance, shadowing the stage, his presence an unseen, protective shield. The fort was a microcosm of the Army's ambivalent relationship with the West, part military outpost, part bureaucratic morass. Its archives were a chaotic, dusty collection of reports, requisitions, and forgotten orders, presided over by a cantankerous, alcoholic old clerk named Sergeant Miller. Sarah, using her charm and a fabricated story about researching a history of the territory for her students, managed to gain access to the archives. She spent 2 days poring over dusty, disorganized ledgers, her heart sinking as she found no mention of the Gunnison battle. It was as if it had been deliberately expunged from the record. On the verge of giving up, she found an old, misfiled requisition log from Cain's company. Tucked into the back, used as a bookmark, was a single, folded piece of paper. It was not the official report. It was something far more damning. It was a handwritten preliminary field report, written by a young lieutenant in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, before the official story had been concocted. The lieutenant, a man named Harris, had clearly been horrified by what he had witnessed. His report described the attack on a sleeping, non-hostile village, and it specifically mentioned the high number of non-combatant casualties, including women and children. Most damning of all, at the bottom, there was a handwritten order from Captain Nathaniel Cain, scrawled in angry, bold letters. This report is inaccurate and inflammatory. Bury it. A revised, official report will be filed. It was the smoking gun. It was the truth, written in the hand of a soldier with a conscience, and suppressed by the hand of a butcher. But as Sarah was leaving the fort, her precious discovery hidden in her valise, her luck ran out. 2 of Cain's men, who had been watching the fort, accosted her on the trail. They were not there to intimidate her, they were there to retrieve the evidence and eliminate the witness. The confrontation happened in a lonely stretch of road, miles from the fort. Just as they were dragging Sarah from the stagecoach, a silent, deadly force erupted from the rocks above the trail. Luca, who had been shadowing them the entire time, attacked. It was not a gunfight. It was a hunt. Luca used the terrain, his bow, and his terrifying silence to his advantage. He was a phantom, his arrows appearing from nowhere, disabling one man's horse, pinning another's arm to the side of the coach. The 2 enforcers, caught in the open, panicked. They were gunmen, accustomed to fighting in saloons and streets, not against an unseen enemy in the wilderness. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. Luca left them alive but disarmed and bound, a message to Cain that his reach was long, but not long enough. Luca and Sarah rode back to Rio Vista, not on the main trail, but through the wilderness, the lieutenant's report a sacred, dangerous relic in their possession. The journey forged a new, deeper bond between them. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, bound by a shared risk and a shared purpose. As they rode, Luca found himself opening up to her, speaking of his mother, of his life between 2 worlds, of the deep, aching wound that had never healed. Sarah, in turn, spoke of her father, of her belief in the power of words and truth to build a better world. They were 2 profoundly different people, silent, haunted warrior and the articulate, idealistic journalist, but they found in each other a shared core of integrity. a shared belief that some things were worth fighting and dying for. They returned to Rio Vista under the cover of darkness, with the proof that could destroy Nathaniel Kane. But they both knew that possessing the truth and revealing it were two very different things. Kane was now a cornered animal. He would not allow himself to be destroyed by a piece of paper. He would respond with the only language he truly understood: overwhelming and indiscriminate violence. The echoes of the Gunnison had been found, and now they were about to be replayed in the streets of Rio Vista. The return of Luca and Sarah to Rio Vista with the damning field report was not a quiet homecoming. It was the spark that lit a fuse on a powder keg of communal resentment. The truth of the Gunnison massacre, as contained in the young lieutenant's horrified account, was more powerful than any bullet. Sarah, with no press to print the story, became a town crier, a Joan of Arc for the dispossessed. She convened a secret meeting, not in the town hall, but in the large, sturdy barn of a sympathetic homesteader, a man whose family was on the verge of being foreclosed upon by Kane's bank. The attendees were a cross-section of Kane's victims. There were the white homesteaders, their faces etched with the harsh lines of a losing battle against usurious loans and intimidation. There were the elders and young warriors from the Ute shantytown, including a wary but intrigued Black Eagle, their presence a shocking and unprecedented event in the valley's segregated history. And there was the small, merging middle ground, the town doctor, the blacksmith, and even a few of the more conscientious merchants who had grown sick of living under Kane's thumb. It was a tense, volatile gathering, a room full of historical animosity and mutual suspicion. The whites saw the Utes as savages, the Utes saw the whites as thieves. Luca Redhawk stood in the center of it all, the living embodiment of their division. It was Sarah who spoke first, her voice clear and strong in the lantern-lit barn, a beacon of reason in a sea of emotion. She did not preach or lecture. She read Lieutenant Harris's report aloud, her voice unwavering as she detailed the attack on the sleeping village, the mention of the women and children, and finally, Kane's cold, damning order to bury the truth. As she read, a profound and transformative silence fell over the barn. For the homesteaders, the report was a horrifying revelation. The savage threat that Kane had used to justify his land grabs, the very foundation of his protection, was a lie. He had not saved them from a massacre. He had committed one to enrich himself. The Utes were not their enemies. They were Kane's first victims. For the Utes, the report was a painful but powerful validation of the oral history they had kept alive for a decade. And hearing it read by a white woman, seeing the looks of shock and dawning shame on the faces of the homesteaders, was a revolutionary moment. For the first time, they were not just being told to forget their past, they were being heard. When Sarah finished, the silence was broken not by an explosion of anger, but by a low, mournful wail from one of the Ute elders. A sound of grief so profound it seemed to shake the very timbers of the barn. It was into this fragile, emotionally charged atmosphere that Luca finally spoke. He did not speak as a warrior or an avenger. He spoke as the son of two worlds, his voice a low, resonant bridge between the two divided peoples. For 10 years, he began, his gaze sweeping across the faces of both Utes and whites, Kane has ruled this valley by keeping us apart. He has fed your fear of each other, because as long as you are fighting one another, you are not fighting him. He took this land with Ute blood, and he has kept it with white sweat. He has bled us all. The ghosts of the Gunnison do not just haunt my people. They haunt this entire valley. They are the ghosts of the truth. He looked at Black Eagle. Vengeance will not bring back our dead. It will only create more graves and prove Kane's lie that we are savages. Then he turned to the homesteaders. Ignoring this truth, pretending it did not happen, will not protect your homes. It only makes you accomplices to his crime and his next victims. What do you propose we do? The homesteader who owned the barn asked, his voice heavy with the weight of this new understanding. He has the guns. He has the law. We are the law, Luca replied, his voice gaining a new, powerful authority. The true law. A community of people, united. We will not attack him with violence. We will confront him with the truth. We will create a new, unified town council, here, tonight. And our first act will be to issue a warrant for the arrest of Nathaniel Kane, for the murder of the people of the Gunnison River, and for the theft of this valley. It was a breathtakingly audacious proposal. It was not a rebellion, it was a revolution. It was the creation of a new, legitimate government, founded on a shared, acknowledged truth. The rest of the night was spent in a fervor of debate and planning. Old enemies spoke to each other for the first time, their words clumsy but earnest. A new council was formed, consisting of 3 homesteaders, 3 Ute elders, and the town doctor, a governing body that was a true reflection of the valley's people. A formal arrest warrant was drawn up by Sarah, its language precise and legal. Black Eagle, his anger tempered by a grudging respect for Luca's vision, pledged the support of his warriors, not for a war, but to act as the deputies of this new, true law. The homesteaders, their rifles no longer pointed at their Ute neighbors, pledged to stand with them. While Cain slept in his fine house, secure in the belief that he had crushed all opposition, a silent, powerful uprising was taking place in a farmer's barn. It was not an uprising of guns and torches, but of conscience. The gilded cage of Rio Vista was about to have its bars rattled, not from the outside, but from within, by the very prisoners he thought he had pacified. The dawn that followed the meeting in the barn broke on a different Rio Vista. The air itself felt charged, electric with a new and dangerous sense of purpose. The first act of the newly formed Citizens' Council was not a violent confrontation, but a brilliant act of psychological warfare conceived by Sarah and executed by Luca. They would resurrect the town's silenced conscience, the Rio Vista Clarion. Cain's thugs had smashed Sarah's press, but they had not smashed her knowledge. With Luca's help, she identified a small, abandoned printing press in a ghost town a day's ride away. Under the cover of darkness, Luca and a small team of Ute warriors and homesteaders, a mongrel army, as Black Eagle Riley called it, trode out. They were a living embodiment of the new alliance, their mission a testament to their shared cause. They retrieved the old, heavy, rust-covered press, a relic of a failed dream, and hauled it back to Rio Vista. They did not set it up in Sarah's wrecked office. They installed it in the blacksmith's forge, a place of fire and steel, a fitting new home for the town's reborn voice. For a day and a night, the entire community worked together. Then, the blacksmith, a man of few words and mighty arms, repaired the press's broken parts. The Ute women, with their skilled, patient hands, helped Sarah painstakingly sort and set the scattered type. The homesteaders stood guard, their rifles a protective ring around this hive of revolutionary activity. While the press was being reborn, Luca orchestrated a series of small, strategic acts of defiance designed to show Cain that the ground was shifting under his feet. The Ute workers at Cain's mines staged a silent walkout, simply downing their tools and returning to the shantytown, crippling his most profitable operation. The homesteaders, now united, collectively refused to pay their loan installments at his bank, citing legal questions about his ownership of the land. These were pinpricks, but they were having an effect. Cain, isolated in his grand house, began to feel the tendrils of his power receding. His enforcers would ride through a town that was suddenly, enervingly silent and united. The fear they had once inspired was being replaced by a quiet, contemptuous defiance. The culmination of their efforts came on the third day. The new edition of the Rio Vista Clarion was printed. Its front page was a single, devastating document, a full, verbatim transcript of Lieutenant Harris's field report from the Gunnison massacre. Below it, in bold, black letters, was the headline, "The Founding Lie of Rio Vista." On the second page was the full text of the newly formed Citizens' Council's warrant for the arrest of Nathaniel Cain. The distribution of the paper was the town's first, open act of mass rebellion. At dawn, 100 copies were printed. Children, both Ute and Whitticked as paperboys, silently leaving a copy on the doorstep of every home and business in the town. A single copy was nailed, with a railroad spike, to the front door of Cain's own house. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The truth, once a whispered rumor, was now an undeniable, printed fact. It was an emancipation proclamation for the minds of the people. The last vestiges of Cain's authority, which was built on the lie of his benevolence and his protection, crumbled to dust. He was no longer a founder, he was a murderer. He was no longer a leader, he was a thief. Cain, in his house, saw the newspaper. He tore it from his door, his hands trembling with a rage so profound it was almost paralytic. He saw the townspeople gathering in the street, not in a chaotic mob, but in a quiet, orderly assembly, their faces set and determined. He saw the Utes, led by Black Eagle, standing not as savages, but as deputized officers of a new law, their rifles held at the ready. He had lost. He had lost the town. He had lost his reputation. He had lost the war. But Nathaniel Kane was not a man to surrender. A cornered wolf does not reason, it attacks. He barricaded himself in his house, along with Sheriff Thorne and his last, loyal corps of enforcers. He sent a man out the back to ride for the nearest army fort, with a fabricated story of a full-scale Ute uprising, a desperate, final gamble to bring the blue-coated cavalry down on the very people he had once commanded. The Clarion had brought the truth back to life, and now, that truth was about to be baptized in blood. Nathaniel Kane's home was a fortress, a two-story monument to his stolen wealth, situated on a small rise at the edge of town. It was the last bastion of his crumbling empire, and from its windows, he and his 12 remaining men prepared to make their final, bloody stand. The town of Rio Vista, now a unified, armed populace, laid siege to the house, their anger a palpable, simmering force. The situation was a deadly stalemate. Kane and his men were professional killers, well-armed and protected by the house's thick adobe walls. The citizens' militia, while numerous and determined, were farmers and merchants, not soldiers. A direct assault would be a slaughter. Luca Redhawk, now the de facto military commander of the uprising, stood with the new council in the street, studying the house with a hunter's cold, analytical eye. He knew that time was their greatest enemy. The rider Kane had sent for the army would reach the fort in a day. They had less than 24 hours to end this siege and capture Kane before the situation escalated into a full-scale massacre at the hands of the U.S. cavalry, who would arrive shooting first and asking questions later. "We can't rush him," Luca said, his voice a low, steadying influence amidst the council's anxious debate. "That's what he wants. He wants us to get impatient, to make a foolish charge. He wants to bloody us, to create enough chaos to justify his story of an uprising." "So what do we do?" Sarah asked, her face pale but her expression resolute. "We can't just wait. We will not attack the fortress," Luca said, a glimmer of a plan forming in his mind. "We will make the fortress come to us. We will fight this battle not with bullets, but with water." His plan was simple, audacious, and rooted in his deep understanding of the land. The town's main irrigation ditch, which watered the entire valley, ran from the Gunnison River and passed just behind Kane's property, at a higher elevation. It was a detail a military man like Kane would overlook, but a detail a son of the Ute would know intimately. Under the cover of the deepening dusk, Luca led a team of homesteaders and Ute warriors. They did not carry guns, they carried shovels. They worked for hours, their movements swift and silent, digging a new, secondary channel, diverting the main flow of the irrigation ditch. They built a makeshift dam of rock and earth, channeling the full, steady force of the river's water not into the fields, but directly toward the rise on which Kane's house stood. As darkness fell, a new river began to flow through Rio Vista. It was a slow, creeping, inexorable flood. The water began to pool at the base of Kane's property, turning his manicured lawn into a muddy swamp. It began to seep into the cellar, to undermine the foundations of his fortress. Inside the house, Kane and his men listened to the strange, growing sound of rushing water with confusion, then with dawning horror. They were no longer in a fortress, they were on a rapidly shrinking island. The psychological effect was devastating. They were being attacked not by an enemy they could shoot, but by the land itself. As the water level rose, Luca initiated the second phase of his plan. He had Black Eagle and his warriors begin to use fire arrows, a weapon of terror from the Utes' past. They were not aimed at the house itself, which was made of fire-resistant adobe, but at the wooden outbuilding stable, the carriage house, the servants' quarters. One by one, the buildings around the main house burst into flame, the firelight reflecting off the rising water, creating a terrifying, apocalyptic scene. Kane and his men were now trapped in a besieged fortress, surrounded by a moat of their own making, lit by the flames of their burning property. Their morale, already brittle, began to crumble. They were trapped, with the water rising below and the unseen enemy haunting the darkness beyond. This was Luca's true genius. He was not just fighting a battle, he was telling a story, a dark and poetic piece of frontier justice. He was using the very elements of the Valaith water Cain had stolen, the fire of righteous anger to dismantle the house of the man who had tried to claim ownership of it all. As the night wore on, the pressure became too much. Two of Cain's men, their nerve broken, tried to make a run for it, splashing through the muddy, waist-deep water. They were not shot. They were simply captured by the waiting militia, their surrender a sign of the crumbling resolve within the house. Luca, hidden in the darkness, watched the house, his face impassive. He knew the end was near. He had created a physical and psychological prison for his enemy. He had turned Cain's own fortress into a tomb. Now, all he had to do was wait for the devil to show himself for the final, inevitable confrontation. Trapped in his island fortress, surrounded by fire and rising water, Nathaniel Cain was a man shedding the layers of civilization with terrifying speed. The suave politician, the visionary leader, was gone, stripped away to reveal the cornered, rabid animal beneath. He paced the flooded floors of his opulent home, the water swirling around his expensive leather boots, his face a mask of sweat and incandescent rage. He had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and humiliated by a man he considered his racial and intellectual inferior. The thought was a poison more potent than any bullet wound. He knew his time was running out. His men were on the verge of mutiny, their loyalty washed away by the rising floodwaters. The army was his only hope, but they were still a day away. He had to break the stalemate. He had to do something so audacious, so monstrous, that it would shatter the town's resolve and re-establish his dominance through sheer, unadulterated terror. His eyes fell upon his last remaining asset, Sheriff Marcus Thorne. The sheriff was not just a hired gun, he was a symbol of the law, albeit a corrupted one. And he had a family, a wife and a young daughter who lived in a small house at the center of town. They were Cain's final, and most despicable, gambit. Under the cover of the chaos, while the militia's attention was focused on the main house, Cain dispatched his last two loyal, and most ruthless, enforcers. They slipped out the back of the house, wading through the swampy yard, their mission not to fight, but to retrieve a different kind of weapon. Luca, his senses honed by a lifetime of reading the subtle shifts in the wilderness, felt a change in the rhythm of the siege. The firing from the house had become more sporadic, less organized. It was the sign of a collapsing defense, but it felt wrong. It was too easy. His hunter's instinct told him the wolf was not dying, it was preparing for a final, desperate lunge. He left the main siege line and began to circle the house, a silent, solitary ghost moving through the flooded, firelit darkness. It was then that he found the tracks in the mud leading away from the back of the house. Two sets of tracks, heading not away from the town, but toward it. A cold, sickening dread washed over him. This was not a retreat. It was an escalation. He knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, what Cain was planning. He was going to take a hostage. Luca broke into a run, his moccasins splashing through the muddy water, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He was no longer a general commanding a siege, he was a lone protector, racing against time to prevent an atrocity. He arrived at the sheriff's small, quiet house just as Cain's men were kicking in the door. He heard a woman scream, followed by the terrified cry of a child. He did not hesitate. He did not wait for backup. He burst through the shattered door, a whirlwind of controlled, lethal fury. The scene inside was a nightmare. The two enforcers had Sheriff Thorne's wife, Martha, and were trying to drag her and her terrified, weeping daughter from the house. They were not expecting him. His sudden appearance was like an apparition from hell. The fight in the small, cramped house was not a gunfight. It was a brutal, close-quarters brawl. Luca moved with a speed and ferocity that was almost inhuman. He used his bow as a bludgeon, the hard Osage orange wood cracking against bone. He used his knife with a surgeon's deadly precision. He was not a reluctant warrior anymore. He was a man driven by a cold, protective rage, a man defending the innocent from the wolves. The fight was over in less than a minute. The two enforcers lay dead or dying on the floor of the family's home, their blood a dark stain on the simple wooden planks. Luca stood panting in the center of the room, the adrenaline of the fight slowly receding, leaving him with a profound, shaking sense of the horror he had just averted. He looked at Martha Thorne and her daughter, who were huddled in a corner, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, awestruck gratitude. In that moment, something shifted in Luca. For 10 years, his fight had been about the past, about avenging the dead. But here in this small, violated home, he had fought for the living. He had fought to protect a future. He had become the very thing he had once accused Cain of pretending to be, a protector. As he was trying to calm the hysterical mother and child, a new, horrifying sound reached them from the direction of Cain's house, a massive, rolling explosion that shook the very ground. Cain, realizing his plan to take a hostage had failed, had played his final, nihilistic card. He had ignited the stores of blasting powder he kept in his cellar. He had chosen to destroy his own house, his monument to his greed, in a final, spectacular act of defiance, hoping to take as many of the besieging militia with him as he could. Luca raced from the house, his heart pounding. The siege was over, but the final, personal confrontation was about to begin. He saw a lone figure stumbling away from the burning, collapsing ruin of the house, silhouetted against the flames. It was Nathaniel Cain, his clothes torn, his face blackened with soot, a pistol in his hand. He was a king who had just blown up his own castle, a devil who had just emerged from his own self-made hell. He was no longer running toward the town. He was running toward the river. He was running back to the place where it had all begun. The world had been reduced to fire and water, the past and the present collapsing into a single, apocalyptic moment. The roaring inferno of Cain's exploding mansion cast a hellish, flickering light over the valley, the flames reflecting in the dark, swirling waters of the Gunnison River. It was to this river, this site of his original sin, that Nathaniel Cain fled, a man not just running from a physical enemy, but from the crumbling ruins of his own life. Luca followed, not with the urgency of a pursuer, but with the grim, inexorable purpose of a man walking toward his own destiny. He moved through the chaotic aftermath of the explosion, past the stunned but largely unharmed members of the militia, who had been saved from the blast by the very moat of water he had created. He was oblivious to their shouts, to the chaos of the dying battle. His focus was singular, absolute. It was on the lone, stumbling figure making his way toward the river of ghosts. He caught up to him on the muddy riverbank, in the very spot where his mother's village had stood, on the ground still haunted by the echoes of a decade-old massacre. Cain was no longer a powerful landowner or a charismatic politician. He was a wild, cornered animal, his fine suit in tatters, his face a mask of soot and mad desperation. He turned, his pistol held in a trembling hand, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. "You," Cain hissed, his voice a raw, broken thing. "You're a curse, a ghost that refuses to lie down." "I am a memory," Luca replied, his own voice a low, cold whisper that seemed to be one with the sighing of the river wind. He stood 20 paces away, making no move for his own gun. He was not here for a duel. This was an execution, and he was both the judge and the jury. "I built this valley," Cain screamed, his voice cracking with a delusional, self-pitying rage. "I brought it civilization. I gave those savages a chance to be a part of the modern world. They were a dying breed. I was just expediting the inevitable." "You talk of civilization," Luca said, taking a slow step forward, "but you are the only savage I see here, Cain. You took this land with blood, and you held it with fear. You speak of progress, but all you have built is a monument to your own greed. My mother, she believed that a man's worth is measured by the good he leaves behind in the world. By that measure, you are worth less than the dust under my feet." The truth of Luca's words, so simple and so absolute, seemed to finally break through Cain's wall of self-justification. With a final, an articulate roar of pure hatred, he raised his pistol and fired. The shot was wild, a desperate, an aimed spasm of violence. The bullet tore through the air, harmlessly wide of its mark. Luca did not flinch. He did not draw his gun. He simply stood there, a calm, immovable object in the face of Cain's impotent rage. Cain, fumbling to recock his pistol, his hands shaking violently, took a stumbling step backward. His foot found a patch of slick, wet mud on the riverbank. He slipped, his arms windmilling for a balance he could not find, and he fell backward, into the dark, cold waters of the Gunnison. The current was strong, swollen by the diverted irrigation water. It immediately gripped him, pulling him under. He came up sputtering, his eyes wide with a new, more primal terror than any man-made threat. He was a man of the East, a man of offices and ledgers. He could not swim. He thrashed in the water, his heavy, waterlogged coat pulling him down, his desperate cries for help swallowed by the roar of the nearby flames and the uncaring rush of the river. Lucas stood on the bank and watched. He watched the man who had murdered his mother, who had destroyed his people, who had stolen his past, being consumed by the very river that held their ghosts. He could have waded in. He could have pulled him out. He could have shot him, a final, merciful act. He did none of these things. He simply watched, his face a stony, unreadable mask. This was not his vengeance. This was the justice of the land itself. The river, which had borne witness to Cain's crime, was now claiming its due. Cain went under once, then twice. The third time, he did not come back up. The river swirled for a moment, and then was still, its surface reflecting the fire and the stars, as if nothing had happened. Lucas stood there for a long time, the cold river wind whipping at his clothes. The fire behind him was beginning to die down. The shouts of the victorious townspeople were a distant, muted sound. He was alone, on the banks of his personal Rubicon, and the silence he had craved for a decade was finally his. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of the dead, but for the first time, they were not screaming. They were at peace. The death of Nathaniel Cain was the end of an era for Rio Vista. The arrival of the U.S. Army, summoned by Cain's desperate rider, created a tense but ultimately peaceful resolution. Faced with the unified testimony of the entire townoots and homesteaders standing side by side with written confession of Lieutenant Harris, and the undeniable evidence of Cain's tyranny, the Army commander had no choice but to officially recognize the legitimacy of the new Citizens' Council. The last of Cain's enforcers were arrested, and the Army's role shifted from suppression to stabilization. In the weeks that followed, the town began the slow, arduous process of healing and rebuilding. But it was not rebuilding the gilded cage that Cain had constructed. It was building something new, something founded on the hard-won principles of mutual respect and shared justice. The Utes were no longer confined to a shantytown. They were given back a significant portion of their ancestral lands, with legal deeds recognized by the new council and the territorial government. The homesteaders, their fraudulent mortgages nullified, worked alongside their Ute neighbors to rebuild the town, their shared ordeal having forged a new and unexpected bond. Luca Red Hawk was the quiet, enigmatic hero of this new world, a man revered by both communities. They offered him a permanent seat on the council, the position of sheriff, land, anything he wanted. He was the son of two worlds who had, against all odds, brought those two worlds together. But Luca found that he could not stay. He was a man forged in conflict, a man whose identity had been shaped by the very line that he had now helped to erase. In a world of peace and cooperation, he was an anachronism. His war was over, his ghosts were at rest, and he found that he did not know who he was without them. He made his decision one evening, as he stood with Sarah on the hill overlooking the recovering town. They had grown close in the crucible of the uprising, their bond a deep and spoken understanding. "They want you to stay," she said, her voice soft. "They need you. I need you." "What they need is a builder," he replied, his gaze fixed on the lights of the town. "A farmer. A teacher. My hands. They only know how to hunt, and how to fight. The hunt is over, Sarah. I don't belong here anymore." "And where do you belong, Luca?" she asked, her heart aching. "I don't know," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had ever said. "But for the first time in my life, I'm free to find out." He left the next morning, at first light. He rode out not as a bounty hunter, nor as an avenger, but simply as a man. He carried his mother's bow, and in his saddlebags were not wanted posters, but a book of poetry that Sarah had given him. He was not riding away from a past he hated, but toward a future he could not yet see. His final act before he left was to help the townspeople, both Ute and White, begin construction on a new bridge over the ravine where he had destroyed Cain's first one. It was a sturdy, practical structure, built with shared labor. It was a symbol of the new Rio Vista. As he sat on his horse on the ridge, taking one last look at the valley, he saw the bridge, a simple, strong line connecting two sides of the canyon. And he finally understood. He had spent his life torn between two worlds, believing he had to choose one. But his true purpose had never been to choose a side. It had been to become the bridge itself. And having fulfilled that purpose, he was now free to cross over into a land of his own making. He turned his horse north, toward the high, empty mountains, a solitary figure riding not into the sunset, but into the dawn.